Good day. In my programme yesterday, I spoke about the sense of panic and hysteria which exists in European capitals as news trickles through from the battlefronts about the deteriorating situation of the Ukrainian military. And it must also be said, and I will come to this later, the pending arrival in the White House of Donald Trump. And certainly this panic is there, and we had a further expression of it yesterday, and it came from Admiral Rob Bauer, who, as I understand, is the chairman of NATO's military committee. Anyway, I'm not absolutely sure exactly what it was that Admiral Bauer did say, but the media is reporting, and I have no doubt that this is essentially true, that Rob Bauer spoke about the need for NATO to acquire a capability very fast to conduct preemptive strikes against Russia in the event that Russia attacks the West. Several people have already pointed out that this is completely illogical. How does one conduct preemptive strikes against an adversary who is already attacking you? It makes no logical sense. But presumably what Rob Bauer means is that NATO should anticipate a Russian attack by conducting attacks of its own on Russia. In other words, he is talking about preemptive war, an attack on Russia in order to defend the West before the Russians conduct whatever attack it seems that they might be planning. Now, I have to say, again, this is another example for me of the irrational. By the way, and for the record, the greatest of all European statesmen of the last 200 years, at least since Napoleon, Otto von Bismarck, the former Chancellor of Germany, once spoke about the unwisdom of a preemptive war against Russia. He said that those who launch a preemptive war against Russia are choosing suicide to avoid death. And I think that just about sums up the reality of this crazy idea. It is even more crazy today in the nuclear world than it was in Bismarck's time. But putting that aside, how exactly does Admiral Bauer imagine that one can conduct preemptive strikes against the Russians? How can he be sure that the Russians are indeed on the brink of attacking? What is the theory or the thinking behind all of this? Surely, if preemptive strikes are conducted against the Russians will call it aggression against themselves, and most of the rest of the world, I suspect, in that kind of scenario, is going to agree with them. To be frank, I think that this is just an extreme reaction, a panicked reaction, a further symptom of the panic that has just been caused by the Oresnik strike. The Oresnik strike on the Yuzhmash factory has alarmed and the West. That is, I think, putting it mildly. There is agonized discussion about what to do. I noticed, by the way, that Prime Minister Starmer in Britain is today meeting in Downing Street with his top military people. Supposedly this is a stock take, and a British military official has just reassured a committee of the House of Commons today that if there is a Russian invasion of Eastern Europe, as he put it, the British Army will fulfill its NATO obligations and will go to war tomorrow. The very fact that all this is going on is a clear sign of alarm and uncertainty about the military situation, the wider military situation, and the implications for Britain, signalled by the Oresnik strike. But to be absolutely clear, the Oresnik strike itself was not a preemptive strike by the Russians. In fact, attacking a factory is not in itself a preemptive strike, nor would it be a preemptive strike if the Russians were to conduct strikes against military facilities, NATO military facilities in Europe or somewhere else. I say that because from a Russian point of view, they are the first to have been attacked. Missile strikes have been conducted against their territory in Kursk region and in Bryansk region with ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. The Russians have repeatedly said that it is impossible for the Ukrainians to conduct these strikes without significant technical assistance from American and British and French technicians. No one has ever denied that this is true. In fact, I understand that either Admiral Kirby or a spokesman at the Pentagon sort of grudgingly confirmed this yesterday when this person came forward and said that yes, the United States is indeed providing some kind of targeting data information to the Ukrainians in order to enable them to conduct these strikes, though this person, whoever it was, didn't go further and explain the entire mechanism whereby these strikes are carried out. To repeat again, by the way, whilst I was in Hungary last week, this topic came up with various Hungarian officials. I'm again very careful. I'm not going to disclose which official said what, but this very same topic came up, and about whether it is indeed the case that these missiles, the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, can only be launched against Russia with American and British and French technical assistance. And without saying too much, all I would say is that nothing I heard these officials say would lead me to think that that view, that the Ukrainians can only launch these missiles with technical assistance from the Americans, the British and the French, nothing they said leads me to think that that assessment is wrong. That's all I'm going to say about this. Anyway, so there we go. Rob Bauer talks about preemptive strikes against Russia. All has about it something of the quality of a Dr. Strangelove scenario. I think we're all familiar with the movie from the 1960s. It's not quite a case of somebody a general launching an attack on Russia to protect us, to preserve the purity of our bodily fluids. But we are starting to approach that kind of situation where those sort of jokes begin to have meaning again. Anyway, there we go. That was Admiral Bauer. And let me repeat again. It's a symptom of panic, of dismay, of alarm about the Oresnik strike. The fact that the Oresnik strike has indeed caused significant alarm is also, to my mind, highlighted by the fact that the Americans, for the moment, are still telling us that they're in the process of assessing the extent of the damage done to the Yuzhmash factory. Now, this was definitely said by Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh at her regular briefing, and she said this. When asked about the damage estimates for Yuzhmash, she said, "It's still something that we're looking at with the Ukrainians, so I don't have a good sense to read out today." But when we have more to provide, we will. Maybe, and and I'd refer you to Ukraine to also speak to that. Well, if that sounds a little bit evasive, I think it is because it is. I have heard reports, now these come from a very authoritative, very weighty source, that in fact the Yuzhmash factory has been essentially destroyed. That the entire factory, this giant facility, has been destroyed. It's been reduced, if not to rubble, to a condition where it has been made effectively inoperable. Anyway, that was Sabrina Singh, and we can see the alarm that this Oresnik strike, whatever damage it did or didn't do to the Yuzhmash factory, we can see that Sabrina Singh is being evasive about the damage that the Yuzhmash factory has suffered. By the way, I should say that I think it is inconceivable that the Pentagon is not already fully informed about the extent of the damage to this critically important factory. Undoubtedly, they would have sent their people to the site of the factory to find out what exactly did happen, given the strategic significance of the weapon that was used, the Oresnik missile that the Russians used to conduct this strike. The Americans will want to know what kind of damage this missile is capable of, because of course it impacts on their military position and that of the NATO alliance. So they will certainly be at least very thoroughly, if not completely, briefed about the full extent of the damage. And Admiral Bauer's comments perhaps again reflect the alarm that must exist over this strike on the part of NATO. Anyway, the Russians have responded to what Rob Bauer has said, and they've responded with, the responses come from someone who is not a mere spokesman of the Russian government, but he is none other than Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov commented, his comment was as follows: just the other day, Mr. Bauer, NATO Military Committee Chair, explicitly stated that it's no longer enough, and ensuring the defence of the North Atlantic Alliance member states requires strikes on targets in Russia that NATO believes may pose a threat to the bloc. I think there is nothing to comment on here. It's just that they have forgotten all etiquette, publicly announcing their real plans. And just to say, Lavrov said this at a meeting, the 20th meeting of the heads of security and intelligence agencies of the Commonwealth of Independent States. This is the loose association of states, former Soviet states, that was formed following the breakup of the Soviet Union. And what Lavrov is saying is that the Americans, the NATO powers, have always planned preemptive strikes against Russia. What Bauer is saying is simply the dropping of the mask. NATO, the United States, the NATO member states have always have aggressive intentions against the Russians. All that has changed is that the mask has now fallen, and that they're saying publicly what they always had agreed with each other in private. By the way, I think Lavrov here is oversimplifying. I suspect that he is probably right, that at various times in its tangled history, NATO has indeed had plans for preemptive strikes against Russia, the Soviet Union, first the Soviet Union, and then perhaps Russia after the Soviet Union itself collapsed. But I don't think this has always been the case. I think there were periods of time when there was a relative thaw, and plans of that kind were at least put on ice and perhaps even scrapped. I think that the fact that Bauer is talking in the way that he is talking now suggests that there is an internal debate. Debate is probably too polite a word. I suspect that there is a fierce and rather hysterical argument within NATO at the moment in which various people are saying to each other, my God, the Russians have the Oresnik, we must come up with something similar. If the Russians can conduct deep strikes like using a weapon like that against us, we must have the same capability to do the same against them. In fact, we must go even further and must prepare to conduct strikes against Russia ourselves. And of course, the Americans already have plans in the next couple of years to install hypersonic missiles in Germany. Professor Postol has discussed the dangers behind that plan in a program that we did with him, that Glenn Deason and I did with him some time ago. The Russians have always strongly opposed that move. But anyway, whatever. I suspect we're going to see more such deployments or more attempts at such deployments before long, though I suspect that the Russian counter systems are going to remain, at least for the time being, more powerful still. Anyway, that's Lavrov. That's what Lavrov has said in response to Bauer. Bauer's comments, whatever else they have done, they have helped the Russians reinforce their public position. The Russians are able to come round, tell their various friends and allies around the world, the Brazilians, the Chinese, the Indians, and all of the others, look at what the Western powers are doing. They've already, before this conflict began, set in motion plans to establish, to install hypersonic missiles in Europe and cruise missiles as well. That is what the Aegis onshore systems bases in Poland and Romania are really about. That is what this deployment in Germany is really about. When we said at the start of the special military operation that we were taking urgent steps to protect ourselves, that the Americans had plans to install these weapons in Ukraine, we were absolutely correct. And here we see Admiral Bauer, no less, coming forward and saying that NATO needs to have plans and prepare for preemptive strikes against Russia. The West is preparing for war against us, aggressive war, and we cannot be blamed or criticized. Therefore, if we are taking urgent steps in Ukraine in order to defend our own security. So anyway, let's leave that topic and let's turn to the other things that are happening. So we've had the hysteria, the comments about preemptive strikes against Russia from Admiral Bauer. We had the article that appeared yesterday, which I discussed yesterday in Le Monde, about the discussions between the British and the French to send troops to Ukraine. Now, the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has appeared to deny this, but he's denied this using very careful language. He has said this: we stand ready and continue to support the Ukrainians with training particularly, but there's been a long-standing position that we are not committing UK troops to the theatre of action. That is certainly the UK position and remains the UK position at this time. Now, it's the last three words that are important, because this appears to deny and is clearly intended to reassure the British public that Britain is not planning to send troops to Ukraine, to fight in Ukraine. But the words "at this time" seem specifically designed to leave that option open. It is what British politicians call wriggle room. And, well, I'm not saying that that is going to happen. I discussed this extensively in my programme yesterday. What an incredibly reckless and bizarre idea that is. How it can only end in disaster. That public opinion in Britain and public opinion in France is solidly opposed to this idea. That the deeply unpopular government in Britain and the equally unpopular government in France, a government in France which is likely to lose a vote of confidence in the French Parliament very soon, and which finds itself in the midst of a political crisis, for them to start thinking at such a time of sending expeditionary forces to fight the Russians in Ukraine is beyond ridiculous. But anyway, there we are. We can see that David Lammy is denying the reports in Le Monde, but at the same time, he is giving us some indication that the reports in Le Monde are probably true. People are talking about, people are having discussions about sending troops to Ukraine. For all I know, that is a topic that is going to come up in the discussions between Starmer and the British military chiefs when he meets them in Downing Street today. An incredibly bad idea. I suspect that there are lots of people in Russia who are saying to themselves, bring it on. I mean by that there are probably people in the Russian army, Russian soldiers, who would not feel far from intimidated by the thought of British and French troops arriving in Ukraine, and could very well decide that, well, this is the moment to finally even scores and to fight against the British and the French in an open way. But anyway, we will see what the British and the French decide to do in the weeks before Donald Trump becomes president of the United States. Meanwhile, even as all of this is going on, the Russians continue to take their various steps and to make their own assessments. There's been a very interesting assessment of Western intentions and Western actions by Sergei Naryshkin, who is the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, its most important intelligence agency. Naryshkin, incidentally, is an interesting man. He has an intelligence background, but apparently at one time, for a certain period of time, he was also active in the Russian parliament until suddenly he was picked by Putin to head Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service when his background as an intelligence officer was first publicly disclosed. Naryshkin, incidentally, is also a member of Russia's old pre-revolutionary aristocracy. His family actually married into the Romanov dynasty, and a member of his family, a member of the Naryshkin family, was the mother of no less a person than Peter the Great. Just saying. Naryshkin, incidentally, served as an intelligence officer during the Soviet era in the KGB, and it might be of interest to some people that a person with an aristocratic background like him could in fact serve loyally in the Soviet intelligence agencies in the KGB. This is just a brief historical aside of the kind that I occasionally like to do. But anyway, this is what Naryshkin said about the motives and intentions and actions of the Western powers at this particular time. Euro-Atlantic elites stubbornly refuse to accept the loss of their former dominance. They are trying to convince the rest of the world that the only alternative to Western power is chaos, and for this purpose, they deliberately seek destabilization in key regions of the planet. They operate like criminal authorities, following the logic of you die today, I die tomorrow. However, the revolutionary aspect of the current situation is that Washington and its allies have only a decreasing ability to execute their destructive plans. The main challenge they face is the innovative efforts of responsible regional powers striving independently to ensure peace and security for their nations. Unlike the West, which sees everywhere either for itself or an object of suppression, conquest, or robbery, Russia itself proceeds from the possibility and even necessity of synergy of states and civilizations. We are at the beginning of the history of coexistence of civilizations and the transformations of the world order. Just as young wine bursts old bellows, so multipolarity does not fit into Washington's global system of domination and subordination based on the dollar and the arbitrary actions of one state. The key phrase there, a very striking one, is that the revolutionary aspect of the current situation is that Washington and its allies have only a decreasing ability to execute their destructive plans. In other words, the relatively brief period from 1991 until, some years ago, the so-called unipolar moment, when the United States and its Western allies had freedom, effective freedom, to go and do whatever they wanted anywhere in the world because their military and economic power was so much greater than everyone else's. That has now passed. And though, according to Naryshkin, the Western powers still are trying to preserve their global preeminence, in reality and in practice, they can no longer do so because continuously, every time they try, they come up against adversaries, ultimately China and Russia, but the BRIC states and others, that can match their once unparalleled power. I think this is a correct view of international relations, but it is interesting that Naryshkin is using the word revolution, a revolution in international relations, to describe it, that we are in a revolutionary period when the old order, based and centered on the West, is dying. The new order is beginning to assert itself. It's, of course, very famously close to that line of Gramsci's that everybody quotes, that the crisis lies in the fact that the old world is dying, but the new cannot be born. All sorts of morbid symptoms arise in the meantime. And in effect, Naryshkin, who probably is familiar with that phrase, is adapting it to Russian political needs. Anyway, there we go. Let's now look at the general situation, the situation on the Ukrainian battlefronts, because usefully we have had another interesting discussion of what is happening on the Ukrainian battlefields in the British media, which, if not quite as apocalyptic in some of its language as the recent BBC article, which spoke about Ukrainian battle lines being close to collapse, essentially says much the same thing and provides a significantly more factual information about it. And the place that it has come is an article which has appeared just a few hours ago in Reuters, British news agency, and it says that Russia advances in Ukraine at fastest monthly pace since start of war, analysts say. So in some ways, a relatively measured title, but the article itself is considerably less measured. And I'm going to read sections of it. I'm again not going to read the entire article. Russia's forces are advancing in Ukraine at the fastest rate since the early days of the 2022 invasion, taking an area half the size of London over the past month, analysts and war bloggers say. The war is entering what some Russian and Western officials say could be its most dangerous phase. That is an interesting comment. Why is it so dangerous? Well, we'll come to that in a moment, but briefly, because of the West's reaction to these developments. The war is entering what some Russian and Western officials say could be its most dangerous phase after Moscow's forces made some of their biggest territorial gains and the United States allowed Kiev to strike back with US missiles. And Russia has set new weekly and monthly records for the size of the occupied territory in Ukraine, independent Russian news agency Agentstvo said in a report. Agentstvo, or Agentstvo, is, I believe, a Russian opposition side. Just to say, the Russian army captured almost 235 square kilometers in Ukraine over the past week, a weekly record for 2024. So when I say that the Russian advance is accelerating, you can see that even Reuters and dissident Russian websites that Reuters is quoting confirm as much. The Russians captured around 100 square miles of territory, 235 square kilometers of territory over the space of a single week, last week. Russian forces have taken 600 square kilometers, 232 square miles in November. This is again from Agentstvo. And it cites data from DS, a group with close links to the Ukrainian army that studies combat footage and provides frontline maps. So note that they're taking this information from the Ukrainians, not from the Russian military, not from all the various Russian bloggers and military sites, not from Slavyangrad or Intelslava or Rybar or any of these places. They're taking their information from the Ukrainians, and even the Ukrainians cannot conceal any longer the pace of the Russian advance. And then we're told that the Russians accelerated their advance in July, which is about the time I said that the Russian advance was accelerating, and that they control 18% of Ukraine, including all of Crimea, just over 80% of Donbas, and more than 70% of Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, as well as 3% of Kharkiv regions. I think that by now the Russians control more than 18% of Ukraine, though I'm not going to try and give my own number. Anyway, they also say that neither side is giving figures for the numbers of casualties, though these are believed to be high. And we are then told that the thrust of the advance has been in Donetsk region, with Russian forces pushing towards the town of Pokrovsk and into the town of Kurachovo. Russia has increasingly encircled territory and then pummeled Ukrainian forces with artillery and glide bombs, according to Russian analysts. We don't tell which Russian analysts, but notice the word encirclement, that the Ukrainians have been encircled. And then there's a quote from the General Staff of Ukraine, which said yesterday that 45 battles of varying intensity were raging along the Kurachovo part of the front line that evening. As I have repeatedly said in program after program, the reality is that the entire territory in southwestern Donbas, including Ugleda, Velika Novosilka, Kurachovo, Selidovo, Novogrodivka, Pokrovsk, all of these places taken together should be best understood as the location of one giant, enormous battle that has been underway since July, August, with 3 Russian army groups, or groups of forces if you prefer, all operating together, seeking the destruction of the Ukrainian military in southwestern Donbass, and perhaps ultimately planning for an advance west to the Dnieper River. And the article then goes on to say, if Russia can pierce Ukrainian defenses around Kurachovo, which they are about to do, as we will see, then they will be able to push west towards the city of Zaporozhye while securing their rear to allow a swing towards Pokrovsk. And this is the point that I have been making again several times. Let me stress again, I'm not a military person, I'm not a tactician or a general or anything of that kind. But if you look at the maps, I don't think it is difficult to see what it is that the Russians are trying to do. I don't think here it can be concealed. Briefly, the Russians have been taking all of the major positions south of Pokrovsk. They've captured Ugleda. They're about to capture Velika Novosilka. They're about to capture Kurachovo. They have captured Selidovo. They have captured Novogrodivka. They have captured Grodivka. They've captured all sorts of other smaller places like Gornyak and Ukrainsk and various villages, some of them bigger and some of them smaller. And they're gradually clearing up those that are left. They're clearing up Kurachovo. They will very soon capture Velika Novosilka, relatively small place, as I have said, and the Russians have now entered it. And once they do that, certainly they will be in a position to advance west towards Zaporozhye. But if one looks at the map, they would also be in a very strong position to launch an encirclement operation of Pokrovsk. They could cut the road, the main supply roads to Pokrovsk from the north, and given that they're already located south and also east of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, they would also, I think, with relatively little difficulty, be able to encircle Pokrovsk from the north. And notice that these enormous Russian advances which have been taking place have been unhindered by the Rasputitsa, the mud season. The Russian army has been able to keep on advancing despite all of the muddy conditions which many people imagined wrongly would slow them down. On the contrary, during the time of the Rasputitsa, the Russian advance has continued to accelerate. The Rasputitsa has worked against the Ukrainians, perhaps. It's perhaps prevented them from moving their forces around with any particular ease, because they're basically stuck to the main roads as a result of their use of heavy Western armoured vehicles. The Russians, by contrast, with their armoured vehicles designed to operate in this kind of geography, and with their army trained to do so, have been able to continue advancing. And going back to Reuters, Reuters then goes on to say, Russian forces advance in southeastern Ukraine are largely the result of the discovery and tactical exploitation of vulnerabilities in Ukrainian lines. That piece of startling insight comes from the Institute of the Study of War in Washington. Supposedly, the Russians have discovered that in some places the Ukrainian lines are weak, and that's where they are attacking them. The reality is that the Ukrainian lines are weakening all across the entire front. Anyway, there we are. That is Reuters. It gives us an increasingly grim picture of the overall war, the state of the overall war. The Russian advance is accelerating. Yesterday, there were reports which appeared to confirm that the Russians have now managed to bring under their control the greater part of Kurachovo. It looks as if the Ukrainians are indeed trying to retreat from Kurachovo, but they're finding it very difficult because their lines of retreat are now extremely precarious because of the further Russian advances to the south and north, and increasingly perhaps even the west of Kurachovo itself. And the Ukrainians, again, made the decision, I think the wrong decision, to try to defend various villages south of Kurachovo. Those villages look like they're about to be cut off as well, with the result that the Russians are in the process of surrounding the Ukrainians, or at least threatening to do so, in those villages also. Now, the major battle is obviously taking place here in southwest Donbas. This is where the Russians have committed their largest forces. But following on from that article that I discussed yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there is also a major battle underway in Kursk region. The Russians are gradually shrinking the Ukrainian pocket. I saw another report today which confirmed that the best Ukrainian troops have been sent there to Kursk, that the Ukrainian troops in Kursk continue to receive the best equipment that Ukraine has, that this is one area where the Ukrainian units continue to receive reinforcements and get regular rotations. So even as the front line in southern Donbass collapses, even as the Russians continue their advances in Toretsk, here they've been taking it slower, but they're continuing to gain ground, even as the Russians begin to storm central Chasiv Yar, which apparently they are doing. They're now well inside the industrial zone, and they're fighting for the refractory plant of Chasiv Yar, apparently the biggest factory there. It's widely accepted that if the Russians capture the industrial zone, then the rest of Chasiv Yar becomes undefendable. Even as the Russians, according to the very latest reports, have crossed the Oskol River north of Kupiansk. I'm not sure, by the way, whether the Russians still have a bridgehead inside Kupiansk itself. They had captured it, and it was a big story just before I went to Budapest, but I haven't heard anything more about it since then. Anyway, maybe they withdrew, maybe they're still there, but regardless of that, they appear to have across the Oskol River, north of Kupiansk. So it looks as if there's graver problems for the Ukrainians there. Also, even as all that is going on, Zelensky and Syrskyi continue to prioritize Kursk, the battle for Kursk, this small area, relatively small area of woods and forests and little streams and hills, a place of no great strategic or industrial or military importance. The Ukrainians continue to pile troops into Kursk, even though they're now complaining that the Russians in Kursk outnumber them 3-1, and that the Russians have a six-fold superiority in drones in Kursk. And, of course, this is all rationalized. The explanation that is always given for this is that the Ukrainians are hoping to hold on to Kursk in order to use it as a bargaining chip between themselves and the Russians in future negotiations. This is a completely foolish idea. The Russians have repeatedly said that they are not going to do that. That as far as they're concerned, all the territory that they're capturing in Donbas is also Russian territory. They're not going to trade one part of what they regard as Russian territory for another part of Russian territory. And why should they do so when they are quite obviously winning the war? Yesterday I discussed how a battalion commander told the Wall Street Journal that sooner or later the Russians are going to drive the Ukrainians out of the pocket in Kursk. It is only a question of time. Now, it is not just the Ukrainians who cling to this fallacy. The missile strikes with the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS missiles do, as it turns out, seem to be connected with the Battle of Kursk. We had an ATACMS strike, the first ATACMS strike of a couple of days ago. Several ATACMS missiles were launched. I think it was, from memory, I seem to remember that it was 6. The Russians claimed that they shot down 5. 1 was damaged and fell and did a certain amount of damage. The debris did a certain amount of damage. The facility that was attacked was not affected. Then a couple of days later, we had the first. Now that attack happened in Bryansk region, but Bryansk region is relatively close to Kursk region. It neighbors Kursk region. Then we had the British attack, or rather the attack with the British Storm Shadow missiles in Kursk region. And we have been told that over the previous weeks, the British have supplied dozens of additional Storm Shadow systems to the Ukrainians. Of course, dozens could mean a dozen, or it could mean 2 dozen, in other words, 24, or it might mean 36. There are not that many Storm Shadow missiles, and it's clear that in order to have any real prospect of inflicting damage, these missiles have to be launched in swarms. And that means that the level of use of these missiles is extremely high, far beyond the very slow production rate. Just saying. But anyway, the next British missile strike, the strike with the British Storm Shadows, was on Kursk region. Putin has said that this strike was also unsuccessful. Some perimeter guards were killed and wounded, but the command post in Kursk region, which was attacked, was not damaged. And yet, yesterday, reports were circulating that there had been another missile strike, this time with ATACMS in Kursk region. And it's difficult to get a clear sense of what exactly did take place. But the Russian Defense Ministry did report that they had repelled an attack with 8 ballistic missiles, and though they were careful not to provide the exact location, it does seem as if this was Kursk, and of course 8 ballistic missiles probably does refer to ATACMS missiles. The words from the Russian Ministry report, Defense Ministry report, speaks of air defense systems shot down 8 ballistic missiles, 6 US-made JDAM aerial guided bombs, and 45 fixed-wing unmanned aerial vehicles. So we're told that they shot down 8 missiles, and it looks as if one looks at the surrounding commentaries that the Russian Defense Ministry has provided, it rather looks as if those missiles were shot down in the Kursk region, and logically that would strongly suggest that they were indeed ATACMS missiles. By the way, it is not unusual for the Russians, it's not by any means unprecedented for the Russians to conceal the identity of the missiles they shoot down. I've seen that happen many times. I suspect in this case they are not reporting that these were ATACMS missiles because they don't want to be pressured immediately into launching yet another Oresnik strike or something like that. Now, there is footage, or what claims to be footage, of this strike, which I presume has been published by a Ukrainian source. Trouble is, I'm far from sure that this footage is reliable, and I'm not certain of the provenance. And besides that, I can't make much sense of what it shows. So again, bear in mind, I'm aware that there is this footage. The reason I'm not commenting about it is not because I think it's unreliable. It's simply because I don't really understand it, but then I'm never someone who's able to understand footage of this kind particularly well. But it does seem as if there was some kind of missile strike by the Ukrainians in Kursk region. And the Pentagon, I believe it was actually Admiral Kirby, but I may be wrong, he has actually said that the United States has indeed authorized Ukraine to conduct missile strikes using American missiles, ATACMS missiles, and these are intended for defensive purposes. I once remember reading a comment spoken without any sense of irony, made without any sense of irony by a US military official. This is a while back, asked to just explain what the difference was between defensive weapons and offensive weapons. This official, without apparently any sense of embarrassment, said that defensive weapons were weapons used by the United States and its allies, and offensive weapons were weapons used by enemies of the United States and their allies. Anyway, there we go. That this permission to conduct missile strikes was intended to be defensive, to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, and it was intended to be used in Kursk region and nearby. Now, quite why Bryansk region, which is admittedly a neighbouring region to Kursk, should be classified as nearby, I can't really understand. It seems to me that the distances are significant, but anyway, there it is. So anyway, that's the rationalization for all of this. I am not sure whether this limitation applies to the British Storm Shadows. Perhaps the British have been given a green light, and the Ukrainians have been given a green light to use the storm shadows more extensively. I'm not able to say. But anyway, there it is. This does seem to me a rather eccentric point of view, because if the Ukrainians are fighting on Russian territory, which the Americans accept is Kursk region is Russian territory, then in what sense are they properly on the defensive there? It looks to me, on the contrary, as if the United States is assisting the Ukrainians to conduct an armed incursion inside Russia, which, however, the Russians are successfully rolling back. The amount of manipulation of language that is taking place and has been taking place over the course of this war is extraordinary. But these verbal and logical somersaults, I suppose, are an inevitable byproduct of this particular conflict, though they have been taken to extremes that I have never seen before. They exceed even what was said during the conflict in Iraq and my memories of what was said during the war in Vietnam. just saying. Anyway, there we are. Missile strikes in Kursk region, nearby in Bryansk region, but the Russians still advancing. And in the meantime, incidentally, the Russians are continuing with their diplomatic initiatives. So Putin had a very interesting conversation with none other than the Turkish President Erdogan, on Sunday, and the Kremlin has provided a readout, and it says as a follow-up to their meeting in Kazan on October 23rd, in other words the BRICS meeting, the presidents, that's to say Putin and Erdogan, discussed extensively topical issues on the bilateral agenda with a focus on making trade and economic cooperation more effective. With this in view, contacts between relevant agencies will follow. Now, that almost certainly refers to the difficulties that the Russian and Turkish companies have found in conducting trade with each other because of the secondary sanctions that the Western powers have imposed or are threatening to impose on any banks or financial institutions that conduct financial dealings with Russian agencies. So, for example, it has become very difficult now to use the Mir card in Turkey. I have always said that these problems can be circumvented, provided that the political will is there, and we see that in relation to trade between Russia and Turkey, the political will is indeed there. The Russians and the Turks will find ways round this problem. They could use all kinds of alternative vehicles for trade. They could engage in some levels of barter trade as well. It is not impossible. It has been done many times. I seem to remember the Soviet Union did it extensively. Barter trade, however, is awkward and inflexible in modern trading terms, but all kinds of other arrangements can be set up using digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, all these kind of things which can happen under the surface and may not be visible, or at least as visible as one would like to expect for the United States and its allies. In some ways, an even more interesting piece of diplomacy that the Russians are conducting at the present time is the diplomacy that the Russians are engaging in with Afghanistan, with the Taliban government or regime if you prefer, in Afghanistan. The Taliban actually sent a delegation to Kazan. I'm not quite sure to what extent they participated in the discussions there, but a senior Russian official, to be precise, Sergei Shoigu, the head of the Russian Security Council, visited Afghanistan on Monday. And this is the TASS report of his visit. Russia intends to develop bilateral cooperation with Afghanistan in various fields, Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu told the country's Deputy Prime Minister Mohammed Abdul Kabir. Shoigu paid a visit to Afghanistan on Monday, where he met with the country's top leadership. During 4 rounds of talks, he discussed economic, transportation and security issues with deputy prime ministers and ministers. We intend to develop bilateral cooperation between Russia and Afghanistan in many areas. I confirm our readiness to establish a constructive political dialogue between our countries, including for the purpose of giving impetus to the process of intra-Afghan settlement, Shoigu said. Shoigu went on to say that the Russian side is convinced that the establishment of Afghanistan as a stable and independent state is in the interests of all states in the region. Russia will continue to support Kabul's integration into regional structures and associations. This step will allow not only to establish an effective dialogue on the problems of countering challenges and threats to security, such as terrorism, drug trafficking, but also to intensify trade and economic cooperation. Way back in the 1980s, in a previous burst of anti-Russian policy, if you like, there was a long war in Afghanistan between the Soviet Union and backing the then Afghan government against an insurgency that was backed by the United States. In fact, that conflict rapidly evolved into a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it subsequently turned out that there'd been all kinds of officials and discussions within the United States, in Washington to be precise, and it had been agreed before the war even began, before the Soviet army entered Afghanistan, that the United States would support the insurgency against the Afghan government, precisely in order to provoke the Russians to enter into the country where a insurgency could be organized and orchestrated against them. If that sounds a little bit like the current conflict in Ukraine, that is because it is. Anyway, much happened in Afghanistan subsequently, which I'm not going to go into. Suffice to say that the United States itself occupied the country for roughly 20 years. It retreated from Afghanistan in a deeply humiliating way, much more humiliating than was the case for the Soviet army, just to say. But here we see that the Russians are back. One might even say that in terms of proxy conflicts between superpowers, the Russians look like they're going to come out ultimately on top in the various Afghan wars. I would hesitate to say that myself, because after all, Afghanistan has paid a hideous price for all those proxy wars. And if peace is restored to Afghanistan, genuine peace, a peace that will allow the development of Afghanistan in the interests of all its people, not just some of them, then, that will be primarily to the benefit of the Afghan people more than anyone else. And really, one shouldn't look at these things in geostrategic terms. But anyway, it is extraordinary to see that even as we get into a hysteria a hysteria that bears a lot of resemblance, by the way, to the hysteria about Russia or the Soviet Union that circulated in 1979 when the Soviet army entered Afghanistan. Even as we see a similar hysteria built today to an even louder crescendo, even as we have all of these incredibly dangerous plans, sending troops to Ukraine, supplying the Ukrainians with landmines, thinking about deep strikes, preemptive strikes against Russia. All of this talk, even as we conduct deep strikes against Russia. That other war, the war of the 1980s, fought in a very similar way against the Russians, which, to be straightforward, ended very, very badly for the West indeed. That war, which has come to an end in a situation where the Russians, together, of course, with the Chinese and the other BRIC states, are there in Afghanistan picking up the pieces, even as the West has exited the scene. Personally, I suspect we're going to see ultimately the identical outcome in Ukraine. I say that. I suspect that will encompass pretty much all of Ukraine now. I'm not going to spend more time trying to explore what the eventual outlines of the peace will be. But I suspect that it will be the Russians, again, in Ukraine, still picking up the pieces, just as they're doing in Afghanistan, especially given that the war that they're fighting in Ukraine is one that they're going to win. Anyway, that's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Don't forget that you can also, if you like this video, that you can tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Back tomorrow. More from me soon. Have a very good day.